Today I'd like to give you an introduction to the concepts around water-sensitive urban design, explain a little bit about their techniques, the principles that underpin water-sensitive urban design. The presentation today is brought to you by the Mine for Stormwater program, funded by the EU. And that program is led by my colleague who has co-developed this presentation with me, Frédéric Cherki from the University of Lyon, and I'm Tim Fletcher from the University of Melbourne. So what is water-sensitive urban design? Well, if we think about what a given area would look like before we urbanise it, in a situation where we have a forest or some sort of natural vegetation, we know that the rainfall that falls, most of that will end up being evapotranspired back up into the atmosphere by that vegetation. And only a small amount typically will make it into our receiving waters, our streams, our waterways, our lakes. And that water that does make it to those receiving waters gets there by infiltration, gets there through subsurface pathways where it's filtered, and that process takes a lot of time. In the urban situation, we completely upend that. We pave all of our surfaces either with roofs or roads or footpaths, car parks, etc. And we typically, not always, but typically remove a lot of vegetation. And so we have much lower evapotranspiration and we have much lower infiltration, and therefore we have huge amount of stormwater runoff. But of course, and with consequences for receiving waters, but of course we're also importing a lot of water for drinking, etc., and for a whole range of other uses, and we're discharging a whole lot of wastewater. Water-sensitive urban design is essentially about trying to bioengineer back some of the behaviours that are more typical of the natural situation, using a whole range of sort of systems that have been developed over time and that we'll talk about. So here's just a little example of a constructed sort of wetland or rain garden type system. We'll talk about the different techniques later. Where runoff is being conveyed into that, treated through vegetation before it's discharged to the receiving water. In this case, the receiving water is an embayment that you can see in the background of the photo. There are lots and lots of different terms around water-sensitive urban design, so much so that anyone who published a paper explaining all the terms would be highly cited. Those terms vary depending on the country or the region. So for example, in Australia, we tend to talk about water-sensitive cities or water-sensitive urban design. In the UK, they talk a lot about sustainable urban drainage systems. In France, they tend to talk about techniques alternatives, alternative techniques. In the US, they talk about the systems that make up water-sensitive urban design as being best management practices. And so those terms vary in how specific they are, whether they're just talking, for example, about stormwater or talking about the whole urban water cycle, and whether they're about the broad concepts or about specific systems. From my point of view, what's important is not which terms we use, because of course they depend on where we're from and communicating with our local stakeholders. But we need to be clear about what we mean. What are the principles we're espousing? What are the concepts underpinning those, so that what we mean is clear to those we're communicating with, particularly those who may not come from our particular field, who might be coming from outside. Okay, so we often talk about the urban water cycle, but actually traditionally the approach to managing urban water is far from a cycle. We tend to take a very linear approach where we're importing water into our cities, we're using that and typically contaminating it, and then we're discharging it. And similarly, we've got rainfall landing on our city or our town, it runs off, and then we evacuate it as stormwater. And so it's a very linear pass-through system, and that pass-through is fairly unsustainable. One, we're polluting a lot of water, but two, it means that we're not making very efficient use of the resources we have. We're not, recycling, etc. And water-sensitive urban design is essentially trying to overcome the disadvantages of that approach. Water-sensitive urban design in the holistic concept comes from separate advances and evolutions in water supply. So here we see this movement from perhaps the 60s through to now, from being very much just focused on supply to one where we now think also about tempering demand by education or restrictions, but also thinking about what type of water does each use need, so that we're not necessarily using very expensive, high-cost treatment water for washing down the street, for example. Similarly, in wastewater, we started way back before the 60s with a focus really on just collecting that water, that waste, discharging it into a receiving water capable of diluting it, and then allowing it to basically flow away from us. And when our population was low, that was, probably a fairly successful technique, albeit with consequences for the downstream receiving water. We've then seen a much stronger movement towards appropriate treatment, trying to also reduce the generation of wastewater by water efficient appliances with benefits for water supply as well. But now, in the last few decades, a really substantial increase in the prevalence of recycling as well, where that water is treated and then used for a whole range of other uses, in some places all the way up to potable or drinking water. Stormwater has seen a really significant evolution as well, and the primary focus of this presentation is about stormwater. It's seen a focus initially just on getting rid of it to try to reduce flood risk and nuisance kind of effects of having water everywhere, through to one where we think about how to integrate our stormwater corridors in a way that provides good aesthetics and recreation, and now really integrating into the urban design, thinking about the quality of that water so we're not impacting receiving waters, and thinking even about the effects of the flow regime, so we're protecting habitats downstream, and increasingly about capturing that water. I use here the term reuse, although technically it wasn't used in the first place, so perhaps we should really call it stormwater harvesting, but that would have had more trouble fitting into that box, but really trying to capture that as a resource. And ultimately, we see in the stormwater area a much more complex, a movement towards a much more complex set of objectives or criteria we're thinking about. So this is the sort of more complete version, where we're really now moving from what was a single objective management to now very multiple objective management. That's got lots of advantages because it means we're now going to deliver a whole range of benefits to the community, but it also means we need a greater range of expertise in delivering those outcomes, and we need a greater range of consultation and engagement and input with various perspectives in the community. And so essentially integrated urban water management, or water sensitive urban design, whatever we want to call it, is about taking all of these aspects and putting them together into one good integrated strategy.